I've had a number of scares in my life, but this one comes to mind for some reason. In the 80s, I took a number of solo wilderness trips. The first was because everyone else who was going had to back out in the weeks leading up to it, and I went anyway. I found the experience exhilarating and went on several others alone for that reason. The story is about the last one. I was in the Wind River Mountains of Wyoming. It was a place I'd trekked through many times, and the particular loop I was on was the most familiar part of the area for me. I was well equipped, very experienced, and as always, I carried a Ruger 357 Magnum. Grizzlies had not yet returned that far down into the winds in great numbers, so the pistol was mostly insurance against mountain lions, black bears, or any two-legged varmints that I might encounter. This story involves the latter. So at this point, I want to mention a couple of things that salienate to the story. First, one thing I learned on solo treks is that a day in or so, one gets this hyper-awareness that borders on ESP when you're alone in the wilderness. On these kind of trips, I'd be moving along with my attention would be drawn in one direction. 30 or 45 minutes later, another group of hikers or horsepackers would appear. My awareness of their presence would occur long before I could possibly have seen or heard them. I also saw far more animals on solo trips than when I was with others, partly because it was quieter when you're alone, but I believe it was also because of the heightened sense of awareness that came with the profound solitude. I've read about this same phenomenon in books about trappers who went out west alone, and books written by Native Americans. The other point is that if one spends much time up in the Rocky Mountains in the national forests, one runs into wilderness versions of street people from time to time. Every so often on backpacking trips, the group I was in would encounter folks who had clearly been there for a great deal of time. Their clothing and gear would be dirty, tattered, and worn. They themselves would be grimy and blackened from constant exposure to sun and campfire smoke with evergreen pitch interlaid with dust from the trails. They almost always carried guns and said very little. They often were unsettling because they would eye my group's relatively new gear avidly. Once in particular, a group of 3 were latently hostile, although nothing came of it, so back to the story at hand. It was noon on day 3 of a 7 loop when I became aware that I was being followed. My solo loops generally stayed on the trails, and this one had thus far. That afternoon, I kept stopping and watching my back trail, expecting a string of faster moving horsepackers to overtake me. I met several going out, but surprisingly, none overtaking me heading in. As it drew into late afternoon, I moved off the trail and climbed up onto a rocky ridge, where I took cover and watched. Part of me felt foolish and paranoid. Just as I started to chide myself for being paranoid, he appeared. Ragged, thin, and sun-blackened, this scarecrow of a man came slipping down the trail, stopping ever so often to look ahead through a pair of battered binoculars. I was looking back at him through a pair of binoculars so I could see him in detail. As mentioned, he was gaunt, disheveled, and smoke-grimed. It was impossible to guess his age. He wore a felt-brimmed hat, much like mine, but in far worse shape. His gear and clothing were tattered. He had what appeared to be a worn Ruger, a 10-22 semi-automatic rifle strapped to his backpack. I don't know if he saw sunlight off my binos, or if he had the same aforementioned heightened senses, but he didn't look at, nor near where I lay hidden. But he was out of sight as the trail cut into a bit of heavy brush. He didn't reappear, but I knew he was there somewhere, watching. I wasn't completely convinced that he was following me, but I quietly ghosted through the rocks and brush until I was over the ridge and into the shadows. I had about 3 hours until total darkness. I knew where I was from having trekked in this area half a dozen times before over the years, and decided to go off the trail. Bushwhacking, as it's called. Instead of going down the ridge and following the trail, I cut straight across it and snuck across country out about 3 miles. I was always quiet on wilderness trips, but now I was sneaking around like I was hunting for deer or elk. Still feeling a little foolish, but I was trusting my gut. I eventually swung parallel to the trail, but was several more miles wide of it. My hope was to eventually rejoin the trail, making the loop in the next day or so with this guy ahead of me instead of behind. I climbed a second rocky ridge, keeping cover until I found a shoulder screen from sight in rocks and trees. I had never made campfires on my trips, preferably. I use a backpacking stove. I was invisible. After dinner, I stood in the darkness and looked over the way I'd came. Off the distance, maybe a mile or so down in the valley, I could make out the faint light of a tiny campfire. Surely that's not him. He couldn't have known I went off trail, I thought to myself. I checked the loads in my pistol before I rolled into my sleeping bag bivy sack. My plan was to start out the next day as soon as there was enough pre-dawn light to safely travel. I wanted to put more distance between me and this guy. Him being in front of me was out of the question. I knew somehow that for whatever the reason, I was now roughly 24 miles on foot from my car and was being followed. I woke up at 0400 in pitch blackness. Dawn was at least 2.5 hours away, this being late August. Glancing in his direction, I saw nothing but the dark shapes of the mountains around me. His campfire was burned out. As soon as there was enough pre-dawn light gray to navigate, I set off. I was traveling in a wider version of my planned trail loop. This threatened to add another day to the trip, but I had enough extra food. I'd given myself a 2-day cushion of vacation time. I hadn't actually seen him in the last couple of times I looked back that morning, but I'd seen the glint of reflective light, as if off his binoculars while he looked after me. Although I wasn't as relaxed as previous trips, I felt this perverse thrill. I liked the idea of trying to throw someone off my trail like an 1840s mountain man, trying to elude a Shoshone war party. In my mind, he'd lose interest and go on his own way when he couldn't find me. I hiked hard but quiet. My internal frame pack and wind jacket were dark green, and my wool pants were slate gray, so I blended in to the rugged Wind River backcountry well. I concentrated on covering as much ground as possible while using the terrain to hide my progress. I stuck to rocky dry ground to keep from leaving boot prints. I ate on the move. Lunch was homemade jerky and canteen water. I could still sense this fucker's presence behind me. How far, I didn't know. Near dusk, I hiked up and made a hidden camp in a crevice in a huge boulder field that covered the shoulder of one of the peaks. I was at about 11,000 feet with the Continental Divide scarcely 2 miles above me to the east. I had one more day of hiking south-southwest before turning due west for 2 days. Then I'd be back at the trailhead and civilization. As I did the previous night, I scanned back the way I came through my binoculars. A stab of pure fear bit into my gut. Less than 3/4 of a mile down slope, I could easily see the flicker of a small campfire. Even worse, I saw the intermittent glow of what was obviously a cigarette or a cigar being smoked, not 200 yards down below me. This was no longer any fun. It was the same motherfucker, and there was no doubt that he was tracking me. I was being stalked in a game of cat and mouse deep into the darkest chunk of wilderness in the lower 48 states. I packed up everything but my sleeping bag, my ground pad, and my pistol, and decided what needed to be done, and set my alarm for 0200 and slept fitfully. My watch beeped almost inaudibly at 0200 and I was awake instantly. The full moon was just overhead and the visibility was good. Up near the divide in the Alpine Valley I was in, it was mostly rocks with only the occasional scrubby evergreen. Holding my pistol in one hand, I began to carefully move down the boulder field toward where I figured his camp would be. The campfire was burned down, but I noted its position in regard to the adjacent mountain the evening before. After 45 minutes of steady progress, I didn't need the landmarks. I could hear his low rhythmic snores, and I smelled the remains of his campfire as I crept up on his camp. 20 minutes later, I was perched on a rocky outcropping 10 feet above his sleeping form. He, like me, was sleeping out underneath the stars. I had enough moonlight to barely recognize him. I sat and considered my next move. I rejected the idea of waking him up at gunpoint. I couldn't see his rifle, meaning it was probably laying next to him. Scaring him awake and into a nighttime gunfight seemed a little too extreme. After all, it wasn't illegal for him to follow me. This was public land, and he had not done anything overtly threatening. I needed to let him know that I knew he was following me, and it was starting to creep me out and piss me off. Then I had it. I crept up 9 yards away, keeping the outcropping between us. I pulled out the small spiral notebook and pencil I carried from my fanny pack. Pen light in my mouth, I wrote, I spotted you the day before yesterday. I know you were following me, but I don't know why. It's starting to piss me off. Stop tomorrow or this might get ugly. I could have got you tonight. Move elsewhere and leave me alone." I quietly opened the cylinder on my pistol and carefully removed one shell. Creeping back quietly, I left a note in the shell in front of his camp, weighed down by 3 small rocks with the 3/4 of the note sticking out. It was 0430 by the time I made it back to my camp, and he never stopped snoring as I left. I started out by flashlight, but almost immediately, that proved to be foolishly perilous. With the moon nearly down, the flashlight was inadequate. I made scarcely 1/4 of a mile off the shoulder of the mountain before deciding to wait until pre-dawn to start again. I dozed fitfully as dark clouds loomed in the north, and a cold wind came up from the same direction. Late August near timberline in the Wyoming high country can easily go from late summer to winter and back again in the span of a day or two. I pulled out my wool overshirt and put it on underneath my windbreaker. An hour before sunrise, I saw his campfire flare up, and I walked carefully about 200 yards that way, cut my hands and yelled, "I'm making hot oatmeal with honey in a minute. I'll make a bowl out of aluminum foil and leave you some if you want it." After a pause, I barely heard him reply. "I just ate," I yelled back. "Then I'm leaving. I left a note outside your camp between us. You ought to read it." I boiled water, had oatmeal and coffee, packed up my gear, and set out again. Instead of looping gradually back toward the trail, I cut sharply west. This trip was over. I wasn't having fun anymore. In a repeat of the previous day, I hiked hard. This time, however, I stopped and ate a hot lunch. It was cold, windy, and snow flurries fell off and on. By nightfall, I couldn't sense him back there. That night, I couldn't see a campfire behind me. He needed one wherever he was because it snowed intermittently all night. By dawn, my bivy sack and the other ground were covered by a dusting of dry snow. That blustery day and the next, other than a couple of backpacking parties heading in on foot or by horseback, I was alone. I hit the trailhead in my car by early evening on day 6. I got on the road straight away and drove 150 miles east, before stopping at Guernsey State Park in eastern Wyoming. I slept 4 or 5 hours in the car and then started out again. In the early morning a day later, I rolled back into Dallas. The experience became a dim memory that only pops into my mind every now and then. Usually, it comes up as a scary campfire tale. To this day, I can't begin to fathom why that guy followed me. Was he looking to finally get somewhere where he could ambush me so he could take my gear and my money? That's very possible. He steadily moved closer during the time that he followed me. He wasn't very careful about hiding his campfires, though. Could be he took me for a greenhorn who wouldn't notice him back behind me. It's also possible that he could have been tired being up there alone for so long, but lacked enough social skills to approach me all the way. Regardless, being tracked by someone through some of the most remote wilderness in the US, outside of Alaska, was very frightening to say the least. Since then, I've never gone on a solo trip again. I still go very well armed. It's sad, because other than that last trip, I really enjoyed the experience of trekking all alone, inside the wilderness.
Some friends and I took my truck up in the mountains during the winter time, and we towed each other on a tube across the snow. We dropped the tailgate in my old long bed Ford, and a few guys would sit in the back with one of those bazillion candlelight spotlights. When I was driving, it'd be fun to make really wide turns in the dark, so the person on the tube didn't have the luxury of headlights or taillights to somewhat illuminate their trail. And the person in the bed of the truck with the spotlight would be funny and shine the light clear off to the side so it was pitch black if you were on the tube. One particular winter night, the snowstorm was rolling in, so we headed up to the usual spot. And it was really dark that night. I was driving while a friend sat on the tube. The guy with the spotlight shone the light clear to the side of the truck, and as I checked my mirror, I made eye contact with a guy dressed in jeans, a red plaid shirt, and an orange baseball cap. As we made eye contact, I lost all control of my body for probably only 5 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. I stopped the truck, turned it around, and asked the guys if they'd seen it. They all said no, so I flipped the truck around and turned on the high beams, and they shone the spotlight all over. I got out and looked for footprints in the fresh snow, and saw nothing. That night we went back home and I told my dad about the weird experience. Didn't think anything of it. A week later on the news, the police reported finding a body in the area close to where we were and asked for any tips. Well, my dad convinced me to call the police and tell them we were up in the area and had seen the guy. I called and an investigator came over to the house. I told him I'd seen that man 7 days ago. As soon as I said that, the investigator asked me, "Are you sure about that date?" When I said I was positive, he showed me a picture of the body they found, wearing the same red plaid shirt and orange ball cap. Turns out, he was a man who'd suffered from some mental handicaps and committed suicide on the mountain 1 month before I saw him.
This story certainly scared me when I read it for the first time. My uncle told me this story, his personal experience with his friend Ronnie one day. Ronnie was browsing on the internet. He read a story about a certain suspension bridge that was located close to his home. The website had plenty of pictures of the bridge and the surrounding area. The next time he met my uncle, he told him about the bridge. It was an old suspension bridge that crossed over a deep gorge, and for some unknown reason, it was a place that was very notorious for suicides. Every single year, at least 5 or 10 people would throw themselves off that bridge and died, and nobody could explain why. They said that that spot was haunted by the ghosts of all the people who had committed suicide there. When my uncle went home that evening, he decided that he had to check out this bridge, and he desperately wanted to see a ghost. So that very night he set out for the mountains where the bridge was located. It took him an hour and a half to get there. It was almost midnight when he arrived at the bridge, and there was not a single person around. It was dark and deathly quiet. The atmosphere was so spooky and ominous that it sent a chill down his spine. "People just fool others about this place," he muttered to himself as he cautiously walked to the edge of the gorge and then peered down into its depths. He began thinking about all the people who had thrown themselves down into that inky blackness. It was all so fascinating that he felt forced to tell his friend Ronnie all about it, so he pulled out his cell phone to call him. However, he was so high up in the mountains he couldn't get any reception. Glancing around, my uncle noticed that there was a phone booth standing nearby. He went inside and put some coins in the slot and then dialed Ronnie's number. "Hello, Ronnie. I'm at the bridge you told me about earlier. Why don't you come join me? It's pleasant and quiet here."
"Why not?"
Ronnie replied.
"Wait there, I'll be there soon. By the way, where are you calling me from?"
My uncle laughed. "Oh, my phone is out of range, so I'm calling you from a payphone." Ronnie was confused.
"Payphone? There's no payphone there. If there was any, I would have definitely seen it on one of those photos."
"Bullshit. There's a payphone on the way to the bridge. Don't delay, there are people waiting outside for their turn." As soon as he said this, Ronnie shouted,
"No, do not move from there. I know that place and I'm coming in 15 minutes. Just stay inside the payphone and do not put the phone down."
What happened?"
"Just promise me that you won't move from there. Whatever others say, just please don't move from there."
When his friend hung up, my uncle felt a wave of fear envelop him. Thankfully, he didn't put his phone down, and the people outside of the booth were just staring at him the whole time. The look in their eyes sent a shiver down his spine once more. 15 minutes later, when Ronnie arrived at that suspension bridge, he found his friend, standing at the very edge of the bridge. He was holding his cell phone against his ear, and he had no clue what he was doing. There was no phone booth, and no line of people waiting to use that phone. If he had moved an inch, he would have fallen off the edge and died. This happened about a year ago. I was on Grindr looking for either fun dates or new friendships. One day, I was scrolling and I received a new message from a guy who we'll call Brian. I took a look at some of his profile pictures, read his bio, and decided that I was kind of interested in him. We start to message back and forth, and he seemed to be really kind and a charismatic guy who really knew how to hold a conversation, something that is very hard to come by on that app. A few days went by. We eventually exchanged numbers, and he seemed nice enough, and I wanted to see if he was as great in person as he was over a text message. So I asked him if he wanted to go on a date with me, and he very happily agreed. So we scheduled a date, and the plan was that I was going to drive to his place, pick him up. We grabbed some lattes at my favorite local coffee shop. It was around 6 p.m., and I sent him a text message to tell him that I was leaving my house, to which he responded with a quaint, "Can't wait to meet you." I smiled at his supposed kindness. Then, in the middle of driving to his house, I receive a phone call from him, so I pick it up, and the conversation went mostly as follows. "Hey, Brian, what's up?"
Hey, quick change of plans. I'm feeling tired and I kind of would rather not go out. Would you be okay with staying at my place? We can watch some shows and order some takeout.
I mean, that's not really what I had in mind. I'd like to go out and do things on a first date.
Don't be such a buzzkill. Just come over. I won't show you a bad time.
As he spoke on the phone, I got a really strange feeling in my gut, like something was wrong about how he talked to me. Before I met him, I imagined his voice and inflections to sound a lot more lighthearted because the way we texted was very whimsical and fun. But over the phone, he talked as if he was in a hurry, perhaps slightly frantic. However, despite my gut feeling, I decided that I would accept his offer. Maybe he was just tired or stressed from a workday. So there I was, pulling into his driveway, and he greeted me at his door. He looked like his pictures. He was very handsome. He was wearing fashionable glasses, and his dark hair contrasted with his light skin. We go inside, and I was greeted by one of his roommates who was playing Dark Souls in the living room. I wanted to be polite, so I approached the roommate and introduced myself. I didn't want to come off as rude to Brian, just in case this date ended up going really well. While I'm talking with his roommate, Brian calls my name and beckons me to walk inside his bedroom. I politely excuse myself and follow Brian into his room. Now, when I walk inside, I saw something straight out of a fucking no-sleep story. Only this was real and it was right in front of me. There were candles lit all around, and when I got a closer look, I noticed that there were several altars scattered across the room. Effigies of ancient-looking figures, animal bones, jars with unidentifiable liquids inside, some sort of dagger next to a cat skull, the whole shebang. I don't remember all the altars, but I do remember a couple. One of them was on the floor, and there was a glass container that held some sort of yellow liquid with animal skulls surrounding the container. Another altar was on a shelf next to his bed, and this one had candles surrounding some sort of doll with its eyes sewn shut and hands missing. Now that one was creepy and super bizarre. A part of me was telling me to nope the fuck out of there immediately, but I thought maybe I was just overreacting to someone's religious choices. I didn't know much about cult religions, so I didn't want to assume that this guy had any malintent. Plus, I can be a little reactive at times, so I decided to stay and go along with the ride. When we walked into his room, I wanted to calm my nerves, and because I have a really curious mind, I decided to ask Brian what these altars were. And he told me that he'd tell me more about it later. A weird response, but again, I brushed it off my shoulders, thinking that he just might be eccentric. I can be a little weird too, so I tried to be empathetic and understanding. Then I point to one of the altars and ask about it. He frowns at me and scowls. "Don't touch that!" His voice startled me. His intense inflections, paired with his angry expression, sent the lump straight to my throat, and I felt threatened. I was almost 4 feet away from the altar, not even close to touching it, yet he just yelled at me like a father yelling at his kid to stop messing around at church. I was confused and thinking that I'd done something wrong, so I apologized. In the blink of an eye, that scowl turned back into a smile. He kindly invited me to sit with him and watch a show. What really weirded me out was the fact that his smile looked and felt genuine. He had just gotten angry, but all of a sudden, he didn't care and served me up a really kind disposition. I was unsure of how to process what had just happened, so I decided to sit down with him. He seemed to be acting pretty normal once this ordeal had happened. We started to talk about ourselves. After some time, he became really sweet and soft-spoken, similar to how he was over text message, and we were able to share some stories about our own lives. It was starting to feel like an actual first date. My nerves subsided a bit. I was probably just overthinking everything else, right? Then he turns on his TV. Now, mind you, I was still a little freaked out by this random outburst, so I was definitely still on my guard. I offered to invite his roommate to come hang out with us. Brian's roommate seemed like an average Joe when I met him, so I just wanted someone else to be there to act as a sort of buffer. I wanted to see how he would act around other people, but when I gave him my idea, he immediately shut me down, and his personality switched from easygoing to stressed and angry. He started cussing out his roommate to me, making it clear that he absolutely hated him. The switch was so jarring, I began to panic once more. Then he changed the subject and started to talk about me. Said that he found me really attractive, and in the process, his fingers started to graze my thighs. I needed a second to collect myself though, so I excused myself to get some water. When I stood up, he immediately slapped my ass and told me not to take too long. I walked out and closed the door behind me. I started to make my way to the kitchen, and I was hoping to chat with his roommate on the way to see if I could ask about Brian. But he was now asleep on the living room couch, so I just made a beeline to the cabinets in search of a cup. I thought about walking out and driving home because I didn't really appreciate the sudden touchiness, but I started to get paranoid. He had all those altars, and he didn't tell me what they were for. I've seen some horror films about the occult, and I truly had no idea what this guy was capable of. Yeah, he was sweet at times, but he was showing me some really aggressive behavior. Who's to say that this guy isn't capable of doing some kind of voodoo curse on me? Dramatic, I know, but you can never really be too sure. So I grabbed my water and cautiously headed back to his room. When I walked back inside, I saw him sitting on the couch with his legs crisscrossed and his eyes closed. When I approached him, I saw his mouth moving, but didn't hear anything coming from it. Weirded out by this, I called his name, and he didn't respond. Strange. Called his name a second time. He opened up his eyes, uncrossed his legs, and went back to watching TV, all without addressing what he was doing. What the fuck? I was getting really worried, but I did what I could to keep my cool. I didn't want to do anything to upset him or make him lose his cool. I sat next to him on the couch and we started talking again. But once again, he was completely normal. Unnervingly normal. It was like I was sitting in the room with a real-life Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, except Brian was able to switch between them seamlessly. I needed to do something. But what was I supposed to do? I couldn't call him out because he might lash out in some malicious way. But I also didn't want to stay because he was freaking me the hell out. I ended up just staying, and I tried to devise some sort of plan to get out of there without making him angry. At some point, he gets up to grab his phone. I thought I might try dishing out the same kind of ass grab that he gave to me when I went to get water. Maybe it would release the tension that I was feeling. And maybe he'd like it, and it'd make him less aggressive. Regardless, I wanted to try something. I made my move and gave him a cheeky ass grab. Immediately, he turned around and swatted my hand away and lunged at me. His hand was curled up in a fist, and he flung it towards my face. His fist was inches away from making contact with my right cheek, but stopped mid-punch. In that moment, I saw that his eyes were wide open, and his facial expressions was cold and emotionless. He was right in my face. My heart was beating so fast that I felt like it was seconds away from an aneurysm. He looked directly at me, and my eyes stared back. At that moment, I felt like prey to his predator. He uncurled his fist, put his icy hands on both sides of my face, and started to squeeze. "You're just so cute." He pulled me in and forced a kiss. I absolutely did not want to kiss him, but I was paralyzed and could not will myself to push him away. His words were patronizing, sort of like he was talking to a dog. And it even felt more like this because he had just scrunched my face against his. I felt disgusting kissing someone who had almost punched me in the face, but there was nothing I could do in that moment. Again, I did not want to risk pissing him off. He slowly pulled away and gave me another sweet smile and then sat down, pretending that nothing had just happened, and started staring back at the TV. Yep, I'm over this. Completely. His behavior had become more erratic and more unpredictable. His room was fucking creepy as shit, and he clearly had associations with some sort of cult. And frankly, he was scaring me. I eventually decided that I'd rather deal with the voodoo-looking altars later on than stay in his house and have to put up with the immediate danger. So I snapped myself out of my anxiety-induced trance, stood up and told him that I was starting to get sick and wanted to go home. He got angry, tried to convince me to stay the night, but I gathered my courage and insisted that it was time for me to leave. He begrudgingly let me, but it was clear that my decision pissed him off, but I didn't care anymore. I said my goodbyes and told him that I'd text him later, thinking, fuck that, to myself while doing so. I got to my car, drove home shaking and sweating. Felt relieved to get out of there, but nervous that he actually might try to do something. The uncertainty of it all is what truly shakes me up, but thankfully, no actual harm came to me. Who knows what would have happened if I actually stayed though. I blocked Brian's number as well as his Grindr profile, and even now, I keep my own photos private. I haven't heard from him since, and I still fear that he's gonna try to come after me somehow. So to Brian, the erratic occultist, let's never meet again. Hey everyone, thanks for listening if you stuck around to this point. If you haven't yet, feel free to hit that like button, the subscribe button, and that notification bell to be notified when future episodes come out. If you have a true scary story of your own, feel free to send it to my email or post it to my subreddit. You can stalk me on Twitter, you can stalk me on Facebook, and you can also stalk me on Instagram. All these links are below. What's up guys, how you doing? What's going on? First and foremost, I definitely need to apologize. I completely dropped the ball on Thursday, and then Friday I had just a bunch of personal shit come up. It was kind of a crazy weekend, and then yeah, I know I normally put out a true scary stories or true horror stories on Thursday or whatever, but I'm making it up for it now. Also, huge shout out to my guest, amazing narrator, so go check out his channel if you haven't yet. I'm sure that you have, because he's a pretty big name. I'm probably going to continue to feature as many narrators as I can on the true scary stories, true horror stories, to make it a little bit longer. I'm also doing more of a job now, like filtering through stories and stuff like that. I have to be completely honest, there has been a time, especially early on in my channel, where I didn't vet a lot of stories. I would just kind of mass send out messages to people on Reddit if their story was even relatively close to whatever that theme was. Didn't matter if the story was actually scary or not. And I've actually been taking the time to read these stories and reread these stories and make sure that they're actually quality content, well written. There's actually, a point and a subject, and I'm trying not to get too many stories that are redundant. And there's a lot of those stories that really aren't that scary, and I've read them in the past, and even as I'm reading, I'm like, damn, this isn't really that scary. So I'm trying to remove that type of thing to happen in my channel, because even if my episodes are shorter in the future, I'm going for quality instead of quantity. There's a lot of channels out there, and again, myself included, who have made this mistake and have done this just to have a story, just to make it a little bit longer. You just throw any story in there. And I don't want to associate my channel with that anymore. I want to give you quality and not quantity. I'd rather give you 3 stories for 20 minutes that are 3 really good stories, rather than 6 to 8 shorter stories that aren't that scary. It's just filler. So that's something I'm going to start really integrating into my channel. So hopefully that's cool with you, because that's what I'm going to continue to do from now on. I'd rather, again, quality over quantity. I want people to stay and get scared on this channel, rather than listening to some of these stories, rather than just like, oh, yeah, it was boring, but it's 40 minutes, so whatever, So sorry about last week again. Hopefully this makes up for it. Again, check out his channel, and I got some trucker stories coming up for you the next couple of days, so look out for that, and I'll see you then. Cheers.